4 million tons of pesticides are applied to agricultural land every year, creating a chemical pressure that has severely degraded the soil. Thousands of ducks are released directly into these rice paddies right in the middle of the growing season, with no fences or constant human supervision to guide them. Why would such a chaotic release of animals into a fragile ecosystem be considered a rescue mission rather than a disaster? One might assume the birds would trample the delicate stalks or consume the grain, but the reality of this ecological interaction is far more complex and efficient. The ducks act as a natural filtration and maintenance system, addressing the fact that more than 40% of the farmland has reached a critical level of degradation due to industrial exhaustion. One can notice how the ducks navigate the narrow spaces between the rice plants, their feet stirring the sediment in a continuous motion. It seems simple to let nature take its course, but in reality, this is a calculated biological intervention aimed at reversing decades of chemical saturation. This method does not end with the mere presence of the birds. The process is only gaining momentum as the movement of the ducks oxygenates the water, and their waste provides immediate organic nutrients to the soil. Everything only gets more complicated when analyzing the long-term results of this traditional practice. After just one full growing season, the rice fields did not collapse under the weight of the biological load. Instead, the ecosystem began a measurable recovery, proving that the ancient technique could withstand the demands of modern food production. One can notice how the water clarity improves as the ducks consume the pests and weeds that otherwise require heavy chemical intervention. The equipment used here is biological rather than mechanical, yet it performs the same functions of pest control and fertilization with zero carbon emissions. It is visible how the plants grow taller and more resilient without the burden of synthetic additives. This strategy challenges the dominance of modern industrial agriculture by demonstrating that a balanced ecosystem can outperform chemical dependency. The transformation of the landscape moves from a state of toxic stagnation to a self-sustaining cycle of growth. This marks the transition of the farmland back to its natural productive state. 100 years, less than a century, is all it took for the vast farmlands of the planet to undergo a total mechanical transformation. Why did this shift happen so rapidly across every continent? At first glance, the change seems like a simple transition to efficiency, but in reality, it was a complete dismantling of traditional labor. Automated transplanters, heavy-duty harvesters, and wide-span sprayers now perform the tasks that once required thousands of human hands. But this is just the beginning. The process of intensification only gained momentum with the introduction of synthetic additives. One can notice how synthetic fertilizers force crops to accelerate their natural growth cycles beyond biological norms. Simultaneously, chemical pesticides allow for the suppression of insects and pathogens on a scale that was physically impossible in previous eras. As a direct consequence of these technologies, global food output surged by several hundred%. However, such industrial power comes at a price that is becoming impossible to ignore as the years pass. Agriculture currently accounts for approximately 20 to 25% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. The majority of these gases originate from the heavy use of chemical fertilizers and the physical degradation of the terrain itself. It only looks obvious that chemicals protect the plants, but in reality, pesticides have decimated the populations of soil microorganisms. This destruction disrupts the delicate biological cycles that historically maintain the fertility of the earth without human interference. Everything only gets more complicated as the land loses its natural resilience. Because of this systemic disruption, over 40% of the world's total agricultural territory is steadily losing its inherent capacity for regeneration. This creates a forced dependence where farmers must apply increasingly massive quantities of chemicals and fertilizers simply to prevent their annual yields from collapsing. It is visible how the soil becomes a passive medium rather than a living system. The process is only gaining momentum toward a critical threshold. More than half of the human population currently depends on rice as their primary source of sustenance. These flooded fields are not merely isolated farming systems. They serve as the absolute foundation for global food security. When this specific ecosystem begins to fail, the resulting instability does not remain confined to a single region. Instead, the risk radiates outward through the entire supply chain that supports billions of individuals. A dangerous cycle now operates in the background, quietly eroding the strength of agricultural ecosystems with every passing season. It seems simple to continue the current path, but the weakening of the land is a physical reality that machines cannot fix. If the very methods used to feed the world are the ones creating these structural failures, the search for a genuine solution becomes the next mandatory stage of development. This realization marks the end of an era of unchecked expansion and the beginning of a necessary technical reassessment. 600 years is the duration over which the integrated rice duck cultivation model has proven its technical durability. Why would modern agriculture look toward ancient East Asian methods to solve a contemporary crisis? The answer lies in the transition from a single-purpose production surface to a complex, self-sustaining biological engine. This historical precedent serves as a blueprint for ecological efficiency that predates the invention of industrial chemicals. At first glance, the system appears simple, but in reality, it functions as a highly precise biological machine. Farmers release flocks of ducks into the flooded paddies shortly after the rice transplanting phase is complete. One can notice how the birds move ceaselessly through the shallow water, their webbed feet gently stirring the top layer of saturated mud to improve aeration. The process is only gaining momentum. As the ducks forage, they systematically eliminate young weeds and invasive insects that would otherwise require synthetic pesticides to manage. Because the birds act as a natural filtration and maintenance crew, the need for external inputs is drastically reduced. Their droppings settle directly into the water, where they decompose into a steady source of essential nutrients for the soil. It is visible how the ecosystem converts biological waste into fertilizer without the intervention of heavy machinery or chemical sprayers. It gets more complex further on. Agricultural records confirm that this method has sustained stable yields across 6 centuries of continuous use. The system is not designed for the maximum possible immediate output, but for a calculated biological balance that prevents soil exhaustion. Everything only gets more complicated as the season progresses, yet the fields maintain their integrity. Within this closed-loop environment, major pest outbreaks become rare occurrences due to the constant presence of natural predators. The equipment in this scenario is entirely biological, yet it performs with a reliability that modern monocultures often struggle to replicate. The water remains agitated, the nutrients remain localized, and the rice stalks grow in a protected environment. This lays the foundation for a sustainable harvest that survives season after season without degrading the underlying landscape. The integration of these living components ensures that the field remains an active ecosystem rather than a sterile factory. The rice reaches its maturity while the soil retains its long-term viability. Thus, the material reaches the stage of harvest having been nurtured by a process that balances production with natural preservation. 100% of the young rice plants appear vulnerable when the first flocks of ducks are released into the saturated fields. Why do farmers risk placing hungry birds among fragile seedlings that could be destroyed by a single forceful impact? At first glance, the introduction of livestock seems like a threat to the future harvest. But in reality, a precise biological synergy begins to manifest almost immediately. The ducks instinctively avoid the firm stalks of the rice, directing their attention instead to anything that moves within the water or grows at a faster rate than the primary crop. The process is only gaining momentum. Automated by instinct, the birds target brown plant hoppers, stem borers, and leaf hoppers, which constitute their primary food source, along with various aquatic insects. It is visible how the flock moves in a continuous rhythmic formation across the flooded terrace, disrupting the pest life cycle before larvae can reach maturity. Within a period of just 3 to 4 weeks, the population of harmful insects drops to negligible levels. Simultaneously, the constant agitation of the water surface destroys mosquito larvae and other pathogenic organisms, which significantly decreases the necessity for intensive pesticide spraying. Weeds also lose the opportunity to establish dominance in the nutrient-rich mud. One can notice the ducks systematically consuming young weed shoots, duckweed, barnyard grass, and wild rice that would otherwise compete for soil minerals. Every step taken by the birds interrupts the delicate formation of weed roots, preventing the development of dense vegetative mats that choke out the rice. It gets more complex further on. This relentless physical disturbance introduces fresh oxygen into the water column and the uppermost layer of the substrate, effectively reducing anaerobic conditions and preventing the soil from compacting into a solid mass. The equipment of nature functions ceaselessly throughout the daylight hours. Researchers observe that this activity serves as a form of continuous natural tilling, allowing the rice roots to penetrate deeper into the earth to build structural strength. During this mechanical agitation, duck droppings are distributed with mechanical regularity across the entire surface area, like a steady stream of organic fertilizer. This material is exceptionally rich in nitrogen and concentrated organic matter, feeding the soil and the plants more consistently than a single application of synthetic chemicals. Such a transition to natural cycles minimizes the risk of concentrated runoff polluting the surrounding groundwater or surface streams. The nutrient exchange concludes this phase, opening the road to a balanced and chemical-free maturation of the grain. 150 to 300 ducks per hectare is the calculated density required to transform a chaotic swarm of birds into a precision agricultural tool. Why must farmers regulate the timing of this release with such mechanical exactness? The process only looks obvious, but in reality, introducing the birds too early will result in the total destruction of the young rice crop. Only 2 or 3 weeks after the initial transplanting has occurred, are the rice plants sufficiently resilient to withstand the constant agitation of the water. At this specific age, the stems have developed the structural integrity to endure the bird's movement without bending or snapping. But this is just the beginning. The ducks must be released when the seedlings are strong, as an earlier deployment risks the physical uprooting of the crop. Conversely, delaying the introduction beyond the 3-week window causes the effectiveness of the biological pest and weed control to plummet as the weeds gain a foothold. One can notice how the timing ensures that the birds encounter the pests at their most vulnerable stage. The process is only gaining momentum. 150 ducks represents the lower limit for a viable biological impact, while 300 is the maximum for high-yield soil. The specific number is determined by analyzing the soil density, the water depth, and the specific variety of rice being cultivated. It is visible how the density of the flock alters the environment. Too few birds leave the biological pressure too weak to eliminate the need for synthetic chemical inputs. Everything only gets more complicated if the concentration of the flock exceeds the 300 mark. Excessive density causes the birds to cloud the water with silt, which creates a barrier for light and stresses the delicate root systems below. This turbidity directly inhibits the ability of the rice plant to perform photosynthesis. At first glance, the ducks could remain until harvest, but in reality, the timing of their removal is as critical as their arrival. When the rice plants reach the panicle initiation stage, the birds must be withdrawn from the field entirely. This withdrawal coincides with the moment the plant begins its preparation for the flowering phase. The camera glides along the developing stalks, where the most sensitive physiological changes are occurring. Even a minor physical disturbance during this period can reduce the eventual grain count on every panicle. The ducks finish their task and leave the water, allowing the rice to finalize its development in complete stillness. This concludes the phase of biological intervention, opening the road to the final maturation of the grain. 50 to 70% is the average reduction in pesticide expenditures recorded within integrated rice duck farming systems across China and Japan. Why do these massive industrial-scale savings occur so rapidly? It would seem that removing chemical interventions would invite disaster for the crop. But in reality, the ducks act as biological regulators, consuming pests and weeds that would otherwise require expensive synthetic treatments. Input costs per hectare of rice fields are significantly reduced, often starting in the very first growing season of implementation. Chemical fertilizer costs also fall by 20 to 40% as the natural movement of the birds replaces mechanical and chemical soil enrichment. One can notice how the ducks distribute natural nutrients evenly across the flooded plains as they swim between the stalks. This reduction in overhead is a matter of survival for small farming households facing rising global agricultural prices. But this is just the beginning. The market value of the grain itself undergoes a fundamental transformation during the harvest period. Rice produced through these organic interactions is classified as ecological or low-chemical grain, distinguishing it from mass-produced industrial varieties. In many Asian markets, this specialty product sells for 10 to 30% more than conventionally grown rice. Consumers are willing to pay this premium for safety and sustainability they can recognize. The process is only gaining momentum as the secondary product reaches maturity alongside the plants. The duck flock becomes a distinct economic commodity that creates a separate stream of revenue for the enterprise. Because the birds have constant access to natural food sources within the fields, they grow rapidly with a low reliance on commercial feed. Minimal dependence on antibiotics further reduces the biological risks and costs associated with traditional poultry farming. At the end of the agricultural cycle, farmers sell the duck meat or eggs to generate income independent of fluctuating global rice prices. This diversification helps spread market risk across two different biological sectors simultaneously. Revenue from the ducks is frequently high enough to offset a large share of the primary rice production costs. The system transitions to the next level of efficiency, turning an ecological cycle into a self-balancing economic model. 20 to 30% is the measured reduction in methane emissions recorded in studies comparing these fields to chemical-intensive operations. Why does the withdrawal of synthetic inputs trigger such a dramatic environmental shift? The removal of chemicals allows the water to gradually become clearer as algae levels drop and the sharp scent of anaerobic decay vanishes from the air. But this is just the beginning. The rice field no longer operates as a singular starch factory. Creatures that were once pushed out of the farming system by industrial methods start to return to the paddies. Beneficial insects appear first, followed by the arrival of frogs, small fish, dragonflies, and various species of water birds. It is visible how the landscape slowly reclaims its role as a living ecosystem through this return of biodiversity. Everything only gets more complicated as the biological cycles reconnect. One can notice how the constant movement of the ducks disrupts the anaerobic conditions within the saturated soil. At first glance, this activity seems like simple foraging, but in reality, it addresses the primary factor behind methane production in flooded rice paddies. By oxygenating the substrate, the ducks ensure that rice fields do not merely reduce their environmental footprint. The process is only gaining momentum as these fields actively contribute to mitigating the broader effects of climate change. It only looks obvious that this model is about reducing harm. In reality, the transition moves toward a system of regenerative agriculture where the soil is restored over time. Biological cycles are reconnected so that ecosystems can sustain themselves across multiple growing seasons. The equipment of nature replaces the need for the field to be constantly rescued by external chemical inputs. The camera glides along the thriving stalks, showing a self-sustaining environment that flourishes without synthetic intervention. This transition concludes the shift from industrial production to a balanced biological cycle. The rice field reaches a state of stability where the soil and its inhabitants function as a single unit. From here, the ecosystem continues to develop its own resilience for the seasons ahead. 4 stages of growth define the window for biological intervention in the rice fields. Why must the release of the flock be calculated down to the specific day of the lunar cycle? It only looks obvious to let animals roam, but the synchronization between the water level and the rice height is a delicate balance. If the ducks are introduced before the seedlings have firmly rooted themselves, the birds will inadvertently destroy the crop they are meant to protect. But this is just the beginning. The density of the flock is monitored by the pound per square meter to prevent overgrazing. One can notice how the water level management allows the ducks to swim without submerging the young rice stalks. Precise farming knowledge dictates every movement of the sluice gates. Even small mistakes, such as a deviation of 3 inches in depth, can quickly turn these biological benefits into severe production risks for the entire season. The process is only gaining momentum. External threats remain a constant factor in the open environment of the paddies. One can notice how the perimeter must be secured against predators that hunt under the cover of night. Snakes, foxes, feral dogs, and birds of prey represent a physical danger that can cause serious losses of up to 20% of the flock if the ducks are not properly protected by specialized fencing or shelters. Because supervision requires constant human presence, this risk becomes a real barrier in regions with labor shortages. It gets more complex further on. Environmental foundations are not present in every geographic location. It is visible how the terrain must be leveled to ensure the water distributes evenly for the birds to navigate. Areas without a stable water supply or fields located on steep terrain fail to provide the mechanical conditions necessary for the system to function. Furthermore, rice paddies that have been heavily polluted by previous industrial runoff may not provide the biological foundation the ecosystem depends on for healthy growth. The rice duck model is not a universal formula that can be applied without technical adjustments. Everything only gets more complicated as the scale of the operation grows. Therefore, the system remains a solution that must be carefully chosen, adapted, and applied in the right place under the right conditions. Success depends on the intersection of biological behavior and rigorous technical management. The material leaves the field, transitioning into a calm stage of the harvest cycle. 90 meters is the maximum depth that the root systems of the willow can reach as they penetrate the subterranean layers of the desert. When the concept of utilizing rabbits to revitalize the arid landscape first emerged, Wang recognized a fundamental technical necessity. For any animal life to endure, a primary botanical shield had to be established that was capable of resisting high-velocity thermal winds and the constant migration of sand dunes. Why was the willow selected from dozens of potential botanical candidates? The harsh environmental requirements demanded a species with extreme subterranean capabilities. Only the willow possessed the biological architecture to tap into deep-seated water reservoirs that remain inaccessible to the vast majority of desert flora. Once these expansive root networks anchor themselves, they perform the mechanical task of stabilizing the shifting sand while simultaneously disrupting the kinetic energy of the wind. One can notice how the presence of these trees creates a localized microclimate where temperatures are regulated and life can begin to take root. This is why the willow was not merely a decorative addition to the landscape. It functioned as the primary mechanical switch for the entire ecological circuit. But this is just the beginning. To transform the willow into the structural backbone of this new environment, Wang had to solve a thermal challenge that had remained unaddressed for centuries. How can a sapling survive in a substrate where surface temperatures frequently exceed 70 degrees Celsius? At these levels, the heat is sufficient to scorch insects within a matter of minutes. Furthermore, the wind in the Kabuki region carries suspended silica particles that act like microscopic razor blades, stripping the bark from young trunks and uprooting unstable plants in a few days. It is visible how the extreme environment makes natural germination a physical impossibility. Planting a willow in this territory is not a simple manual task, but a calculated engineering operation against the elements. Technical teams must utilize sensors to track minute pockets of residual moisture hidden deep beneath the surface. When a viable location is identified, deep pits are excavated and immediately reinforced with wire mesh and reed barriers to prevent the infilling of sand during the next thermal gust. The process is only gaining momentum. Young willows undergo treatment with specialized moisture-retaining chemical solutions before being anchored into the ground with rigid wooden frames to prevent nocturnal displacement. Irrigation systems deliver water with extreme precision, providing only the minimum volume required for the roots to detect the presence of moisture and drive themselves deeper into the soil. It seems like a simple act of watering, but in reality, it is a biological race for survival in a sea of shifting sand. Once the initial bands of willow trees reached a sufficient density to cast shade and preserve ground moisture, the next phase of the restoration model was initiated. This involved the introduction of Rex rabbits into a strictly regulated and closed ecological loop. These rabbits were never permitted to roam in the wild, but were instead housed in highly managed ecological facilities where every individual possessed specific economic and biological value. Their fur was processed for the high-end textile industry, while their meat and internal organs were utilized for food and traditional medical applications. But what truly transformed the Rex rabbit into a biological tool was the chemical composition of its waste. Rabbit manure contains high concentrations of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which are the exact nutrients the desert soil lacks. One can notice how the introduction of this organic matter allows loose sand particles to bind together, eventually forming a moist layer of humus. An additional technical advantage is found in the rabbit's digestive system, which is incapable of breaking down grass seeds. Every time the animals forage, intact seeds are expelled within a casing of natural fertilizer, allowing them to sprout even under the most brutal environmental conditions. As a result, The density of the green canopy increases with minimal human intervention. Everything only gets more complicated as the system matures. The structure of the new ecosystem gradually stabilized and began to function like a self-balancing industrial machine. The willow canopies provided a consistent source of shade and nutrition for the rabbit population. In exchange, the rabbits provided the land with the nutrient-rich humus required for the soil to hold moisture and resist the forces of erosion. This closed-loop system turned every single hectare of sand into an organic factory capable of producing over 5 tons of humus on an annual basis. Transition to the next level occurred as the land transformed. 1,000 kilograms of organic matter can change the physical properties of the earth over time. In a period of just 3 to 5 years, a stretch of desert that was once as hard as rock is converted into fertile territory. As this industrial model scaled upward, more than 200 million willow trees formed a massive geographical barrier. This biological wall successfully reduced wind speeds by 90% and prevented the displacement of 15 million tons of sand every single year. It is visible how areas that were once completely defenseless against seasonal sandstorms have now been blanketed in greenery across 800 square miles. This restored territory provided the necessary physical foundation to expand the Rex rabbit farming operations even further. As the local ecosystem reached a state of equilibrium, a population of 1,200,000 rabbits served as both an environmental regenerator and an economic catalyst. The system now generates over 100 million yuan annually, providing sustainable livelihoods for thousands of families in a region that was once categorized as uninhabitable. The material transformation of the desert concludes this phase, opening the road to long-term stability. 100% of the value found in the integration of rice and ducks stems from a philosophy that transcends simple agricultural techniques. Why does this ancient synergy outperform modern monocultures in long-term stability? The answer lies in the biological interaction between the waterfowl and the grain, where every movement of the bird serves a specific mechanical and chemical purpose. It only looks obvious that farming requires total human control, but in reality, the most efficient systems are those that allow natural cycles to regulate themselves without external interference. This method serves as a physical reminder of ecological resilience. But this is just the beginning. Modern industrial agriculture is currently reaching its physical and chemical limits as soil health declines across the globe. One can notice how the reliance on synthetic inputs creates a cycle of diminishing returns that requires more energy for less output. The equipment gradually transitions toward a model where deeper comprehension of natural mechanics replaces the brute force of chemical application. Transition to the next level. The constant pressure to maximize yields often overlooks the inherent power of a balanced ecosystem. It is visible how the ducks move through the flooded paddies, their feet churning the water to oxygenate the soil while they consume pests that would otherwise require toxic pesticides. Everything only gets more complicated when these natural agents are removed from the equation, leading to a breakdown in the system's internal logic. Global food security may ultimately depend on these fundamental principles that have existed for centuries. At first glance, the process seems primitive compared to laboratory-grown solutions, but in reality, it remains profoundly relevant as a blueprint for sustainable production. The camera glides along the verdant fields where the symbiotic relationship ensures a harvest that is both clean and consistent. The process is only gaining momentum. The future of the engineered and natural world relies on the successful synchronization of these hidden systems. This represents a shift away from isolated technology toward a comprehensive understanding of how living organisms and environmental variables function as a single unit. Thus ends one of the key stages in the analysis of sustainable food systems, as the material is ready to move into the next processing phase of global implementation without haste.